The shuttle dropped out of hyperspace, and Commander Ethan Cole pressed his face against the viewport, like a child seeing snow for the first time. His breath fogging the cold glass as the massive structure came into view, a spinning wheel of light and metal that stretched across the darkness of space like a city built by gods who had forgotten what small meant. Nexus Prime was everything the briefings had promised, and nothing they could have prepared him for. A station so large that it had its own weather systems, its own governments, its own wars and peaces that played out in corridors and market halls, while the rest of the galaxy spun on without noticing. He had trained for 2 years just to earn the right to step onto that station, learned 14 languages, and studied the customs of 30 species, memorized laws that made no sense, and rules that seemed designed by someone who hated joy. All because humanity had finally been granted access to the galactic community. And someone had to go first. That someone was him. The shuttle docked with a gentle thud, and Ethan grabs his single bag, a worn military duffel that contained everything he owned in the universe, 3 changes of clothes, and a photograph of his mother, and a paperback book she had given him before she died, a copy of a story about a man who fought windmills because he believed they were giants. He thought about that man a lot these days. The airlock cycled open, and the smell hit him first, 1,000 different scents mixing together into something that was not quite pleasant and not quite terrible, just overwhelming in a way that made his eyes water and his nose twitch. The collective odor of 100 species, living and working and eating and existing in the same recycled air. He stepped through the threshold, and everything went quiet. Ethan had expected stares, and he got them. Hundreds of eyes and eye equivalents turning toward him as he walked into the main transit hall, a vast chamber filled with beings of every shape and size and color, creatures with too many limbs and creatures with none at all, beings made of light and beings made of stone, and beings that seemed to be made of nothing but anger and teeth. But the stares were not curious, they were cold. A small creature that looked like a cross between a lizard and a very disappointed accountant scurried up to him with a tablet clutched in its 3-fingered hands, its scales shifting from green to yellow in what Ethan's training told him was a sign of nervousness or possibly indigestion. "Human," the creature said, its voice high and reedy. "You are expected to report to Processing Center 7 for species classification and behavioral orientation. You will be assigned quarters in the Tier 4 residential section, and you will be given a work permit that allows you to access approved areas only. Do you understand these instructions?" Slowly, taking in the information while his eyes wandered across the transit hall, noticing things that the creature probably hoped he would not notice, like the way the hall was divided into sections by subtle barriers of light, like the way certain species walked on elevated pathways while others were forced to use tunnels beneath the floor, like the way everyone seemed to know exactly where they were allowed to be and exactly where they were not. "What are the tiers?" he asked, keeping his voice casual. The creature's scales shifted to a darker shade of yellow. The harmonic frequency classification system divides all species into 5 tiers based on their evolutionary resonance with the fundamental vibrations of the universe. Tier 1 species, such as the Velkari, are the most harmonically advanced and therefore occupy the highest positions in galactic society. Tier 5 species are, the creature paused and looked at Ethan with something that might have been pity. "Well, they are not allowed on this station at all." "And humans?" "Tier 4, the creature said quickly, "which is perfectly respectable for a species so new to galactic contact. You should be proud." Ethan was not proud. He was angry, but he had learned a long time ago that anger was a fire, and fires needed to be controlled, or they burned down everything, including the person holding the match. So he smiled and nodded and followed the creature through the transit hall, keeping his eyes open and his mouth shut. The processing center was exactly as depressing as he had expected. a gray room filled with gray machines, operated by gray beings, who looked like they had never experienced a single moment of joy in their entire gray lives. And Ethan stood in line with other Tier 4 species, short furry things, and tall spindly things, and things he could not even begin to describe, all of them waiting to be classified and categorized and put in their proper place. His turn came. A machine scanned him from head to toe and declared him fit for manual labor and basic translation services, skills that would allow him to scrub floors and carry messages and generally exist in the spaces between the important people doing important things. He accepted his work permit and his residential assignment and his list of rules, a document so long that it would have taken him 3 days to read if he had cared enough to try, which he did not, because rules written by people who had never met him about places he had never been meant nothing to a man who had grown up being told what he could not do and had spent his whole life proving those people wrong. The residential section for Tier 4 species was located in the lower rings of the station, far from the viewports and the gardens and the beautiful spaces where the higher tiers lived their beautiful lives. And Ethan found his assigned quarters without difficulty. A small room with a small bed and a small window that looked out onto a wall. He sat on the bed and opened his bag and took out the photograph of his mother and the book about the man who fought windmills, and he placed them on the small table beside the bed, the only personal touches in a room designed to remind him that he did not matter. But Ethan Cole had never believed that any person did not matter, had been raised by a woman who taught him that every soul had value, and every voice deserved to be heard, had grown up in a world where people had fought and bled and died for the right to sit where they wanted, and love who they wanted, and be who they were meant to be. He looked out his small window at the wall, and he thought about the transit hall, and the elevated pathways, and the Valkyrie in their high places looking down on everyone else. And he felt something stir in his chest, not anger this time, but something quieter and more dangerous, the feeling that came before a decision that could not be undone. Tomorrow he would explore the station. Tomorrow he would learn its secrets and study its rules and find its weaknesses. And then, when he was ready, he would do what humans had always done when faced with systems designed to keep them small. He would break them. The station hummed around him as he lay down on his small bed in his small room. And somewhere far above him, the Valkyrie sat in their beautiful spaces looking out at the stars, never knowing that the universe had just delivered something they had never encountered before. A creature that did not know how to stay in its place. A being that saw walls as challenges, and rules as suggestions, and cages as things that existed only until someone found the key. Ethan Cole closed his eyes and smiled in the darkness. 3 weeks passed on Nexus Prime, and Ethan learned the station the way a prisoner learns their cell. Every corner and corridor, every shortcut and secret passage, every unwritten rule that governed who could go where and when and why. Knowledge that he gathered piece by piece, like a man building a weapon from scraps. He worked his assigned job in the translation center, sitting at a terminal for 12 hours a day, converting documents from one language to another. Mindless work that paid barely enough to cover his food and rent, but gave him access to information that was worth far more than credits. Reports and communications and official documents that revealed how the station really worked beneath its polished surface. The harmonic frequency system was a lie. He had suspected it from the beginning, from the moment that lizard creature had explained it with the nervous energy of someone reciting words they did not believe. But now he had proof in the form of scientific papers that had been buried and suppressed and forgotten, studies that showed the frequency measurements were meaningless, that the tiers were based on nothing but politics and power, and the desire of those at the top to stay at the top. The Valkyrie had not risen to Tier 1 because they were more evolved, or more harmonically advanced. They had risen because they had arrived first, and written the rules, and made sure those rules kept everyone else beneath them. It was such a human story that Ethan almost laughed when he read it. The same old game played out across the stars. Different species, but the same sad pattern of some people deciding they were better than others, and building systems to make that decision permanent. On his days off he explored the station with the careful curiosity of a tourist, and the sharp attention of a spy, mapping the invisible barriers that divided the tiers, noting which elevators went to which levels and which corridors were blocked by guards, and which were blocked only by custom and fear. The upper observation deck became his obsession. It sat at the top of the central spire, a beautiful space with viewports that looked out onto a nebula of swirling purple and gold, the kind of view that made a person feel small in the best possible way, connected to something vast and ancient and full of wonder, and it was reserved exclusively for Tier 1 species, the Valkyrie. He watched them from the lower levels, tall, graceful beings with skin that glowed soft blue in the station lights, forearms that moved with the elegance of dancers, silver eyes that seemed to hold secrets older than human civilization. And he noticed that they never smiled, never laughed, never touched each other, or spoke in anything louder than whispers. They were beautiful, and they were sad, and Ethan did not understand why until he saw her. She sat alone, on the observation deck, every day, at the same time. Valkyrie woman, whose bioluminescent patterns flickered in ways that his translators struggled to interpret, something between melancholy and defiance. A light that refused to go out even as it dimmed, and the seats around her were always empty. Not because the deck was not crowded, because no one would sit near her. He asked a coworker about her, a friendly Drenix named Vorl, who had taken pity on the new human, and taught him which food vendors would not poison him, and which corridors to avoid after dark. "That is Salith Vorn," Vorl said, his trunk curling in what Ethan had learned to recognize as discomfort. "And you should not ask about her. You should not look at her. You should pretend she does not exist the way everyone else does." "Why?" Vorl's small eyes darted around to make sure no one was listening. She was a scientist, one of the greatest minds the Valkyrie had ever produced, and she made the mistake of publishing research that questioned the harmonic frequency system, proved it was false, showed that the tiers were built on nothing but lies and tradition. Ethan felt his heart beat faster. What happened to her? They did not execute her because that would have made her a martyr. They did not exile her because that would have let her spread her ideas to other worlds. Instead, they did something worse. Vorl shuddered, his gray skin rippling. They made her invisible, passed a law that forbids any Valkyrie from speaking to her or acknowledging her existence. She can go anywhere her tier allows, but she will always be alone, surrounded by her own people who look through her like she is made of glass. "That is torture," Ethan said quietly. "That is politics," Vorl replied, "and it is not your concern. You are Tier 4. You cannot even enter the observation deck. The barriers would shock you unconscious before you climbed 3 steps, so put her out of your mind and focus on surviving your own problems." Ethan thanked Vorl for the information, and went back to his quarters and sat on his small bed, and thought about a woman who had told the truth and been punished with loneliness. A scientist who had tried to tear down a lie and been buried alive in silence. He thought about his mother and the stories she had told him about people who had refused to move to the back of the bus, people who had sat at lunch counters where they were not welcome, people who had marched into places they were forbidden to go simply because the forbidding was wrong. He thought about the man who fought windmills, and he made a decision. The next morning, he went to work as usual, and spent his shift translating documents as usual, and ate his lunch in the Tier 4 cafeteria as usual. And then, when his shift ended, he did something that was not usual at all. He walked to the central spire. The observation deck was accessible by a grand staircase that rose through the air. Heart of the station, wide steps made of something that looked like marble but felt like music under his feet. And at the base of those steps stood a holographic sign in 40 languages warning that only Tier 1 species were permitted beyond this point. Ethan read the sign. He understood it perfectly. He placed his foot on the first step. The barrier hit him like a wave of electricity, pain shooting through his body as the security system detected his Tier 4 implant and tried to force him back. But Ethan had been shocked before, had been beaten before, had been told no in 1,000 different ways by 1,000 different people, and had learned that no was just the first word in a longer conversation. He took another step. Alarms began to sound, soft at first and then louder, and he could see beings on the lower levels stopping to stare. Could hear the murmur of confusion spreading through the crowd. A Tier 4 species climbing the forbidden stairs. It was unthinkable. It was impossible. It was happening. The pain increased with every step, but so did something else. A fierce joy that burned brighter than the electricity. The feeling of doing something that mattered. Of being more than a classification, and a work permit, and a small room with a view of a wall. He reached the top of the stairs and stepped onto the observation deck, and the alarms went silent. Everyone was staring at him now, Valkyrie with their silver eyes wide, and their patterns flickering in shades of shock and outrage. And Ethan ignored them all, because he had not climbed those stairs for them. He walked across the deck toward the woman who sat alone. Salith Vorn looked up as he approached, her patterns shifting through colors his translator had no words for. And Ethan sat down in the empty seat beside her. Close enough to talk, close enough to matter. Beautiful view, he said, nodding toward the nebula. The Valkyrie woman stared at him for a long moment, her 4 hands frozen in her lap, her silver eyes searching his face for something she did not seem to find. You will be executed for this, she finally said, her voice layered with harmonics that made his bones vibrate. Ethan shrugged and smiled. Maybe, but you looked like you could use some company. And for the first time in 40 years, Salith Vorn did not feel invisible. The silence that followed was so complete that Ethan could hear his own heartbeat echoing in his ears. A steady rhythm that reminded him he was still alive, still breathing, still sitting in a place where no human had ever sat before. Next to a woman who had not heard a friendly voice in 4 decades. Salith Vorn continued to stare at him with those silver eyes, her bioluminescent patterns cycling through colors that painted her blue skin in shifting shades of light. And Ethan waited because he had learned that sometimes the best thing a person could do was simply be present. You are human, she finally said, and it was not a question. I am, he said. Your species has been part of galactic civilization for less than 5 of your years, she continued. About that, yes, he replied. And in that time you have learned our languages, and our customs, and our laws. I have tried, he said. Her patterns shifted to something that might have been amusement. Then you must know that what you have done is punishable by death, that the arbiters will be here within minutes, that your brief and unremarkable life is about to end in a very public and very painful way. Ethan looked out at the nebula, swirls of purple and gold dancing across the darkness like paint thrown by a cosmic artist, and he thought about all the ways his life could have gone, all the safe choices he could have made, all the small rooms he could have accepted. I know, he said, but where I come from we have a long history of sitting in places we are not supposed to sit. It usually works out, eventually. Eventually, Salith repeated, and something in her voice cracked. The first sign that the mask she wore was not as solid as it appeared. That is a very human word, eventually. As if time will fix what power has broken. As if patience is enough to tear down walls. It is not patience alone, Ethan admitted. It is patience combined with stubbornness, and maybe a little bit of stupidity. My mother used to say that humans were too dumb to know when to quit and too stubborn to care. The Velkari woman made a sound that his translator rendered as laughter, though it came out more like music, a cascade of notes that seemed to hang in the air around them. Your mother sounds like she was wise. She was. She taught me that every person matters, every voice deserves to be heard, and every rule that exists only to keep people apart deserves to be broken. Salith turned to face him fully, her four hands moving in a gesture that he did not recognize but felt important. Do you know why I am alone, human? Do you know what crime I committed to earn this punishment? You told the truth, Ethan said. You proved that the harmonic frequency system was a lie, that the tiers were built on politics and power instead of science and fact. Her patterns flickered with surprise. You have done your research, Center. I have access to a lot of documents that people have forgotten about, including your papers. Your research was brilliant. My research was career suicide, Salith corrected him, but there was something in her voice that had not been there before, a warmth that flickered like a candle in a dark room. I was young and idealistic, and I believed that truth would triumph over tradition. I was wrong. You were not wrong, Ethan said firmly. You were just early. Truth always wins eventually. It just takes time, and someone stubborn enough to keep pushing. There is that word again. Eventually. It is a good word. It leaves room for hope. They sat together in silence for a moment, watching the nebula painted slow dance across the viewport. Two beings from different worlds and different species, sharing a view that had been designed for only one of them. And Ethan felt something shift in the air between them, the beginning of a connection that would change both their lives. Tell me about your world, Salith said suddenly. Tell me about these humans who sit in forbidden places and believe that time will bend to their will. So Ethan told her. He told her about Earth, a small blue planet orbiting an unremarkable star in a forgotten corner of the galaxy. A world of oceans and mountains and forests that had produced a species of stubborn apes who refused to accept their limitations. He told her about the long history of human struggle, the wars and revolutions and movements that had slowly and painfully dragged his people towards something better. The countless individuals who had stood up and said no, when saying yes would have been so much easier. He told her about Rosa Parks and Mahatma Gandhi and Nelson Mandela, about people who had faced imprisonment and death for the crime of believing that all beings were created equal, about the long arc of human history bending slowly toward justice. Her about his mother, a woman who had raised him alone in a small apartment in a city that did not care about them, who had worked 2 jobs to keep food on the table, and still found time to read him stories about heroes who fought impossible battles against impossible odds. She sounds remarkable, Salith said when he finished. She was. She died 3 years ago, just before humanity made first contact with the rest of the galaxy. Sometimes I think she would have loved all of this, the stars and the aliens and the adventure. But she also would have been furious about the tears, because she believed all beings were equal. Because she knew that any system that tells people they are worth less than others is a system that needs to be torn down. Salith was quiet for a long moment, her patterns cycling through colors that Ethan had not seen before, deep blues and bright golds, and something that looked almost like the nebula itself. For 40 years, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. 40 years of silence and isolation, and watching my own people look through me like I do not exist. And in all that time, I never stopped believing that I was right, that the truth would eventually matter. It does matter. I know that now, she said, and she reached out with one of her 4 hands and touched his arm, a gesture that sent a ripple of shock through the watching Valkyrie. A Tier 1 touching a Tier 4, another rule broken without hesitation. I know that now because you are here, a human who climbed stairs that should have killed him, just to sit next to a stranger who looked lonely. It seemed like the right thing to do. And that, Saylet said, her patterns glowing brighter than he had ever seen them, is the most alien thing about your species. You do things simply because they seem right, not because they are safe or logical or permitted. You act on belief rather than calculation. Is that good or bad? I do not know, she admitted, but it is exactly what this galaxy needs. The sound of heavy footsteps echoed from the staircase below, the arbiters finally arriving to deal with the impossible situation that a human had created simply by sitting down, and Ethan felt his heart rate increase, but his resolve remained steady. Whatever came next, he had already won. He had made someone feel seen, and that was worth whatever price he had to pay. The arbiter that stepped onto the observation deck was not a being so much as a presence, 8 feet of living metal that seemed to absorb the light around it, a construct of ancient technology and cold judgment that had enforced the laws of Nexus Prime for longer than humanity had possessed fire. It was followed by 6 security officers of various species, all of them armed with weapons that Ethan did not recognize but understood instinctively were designed to cause maximum pain with minimum mess, the tools of a system that had perfected the art of making examples out of those who dared to step out of line. Human designation Ethan Cole, the arbiter said, its voice resonating through the deck like a funeral bell. You have violated Section 7 of the Harmonic Frequency Accord by entering a Tier 1 restricted zone without authorization. You have further violated Section 12 by making physical proximity with a Tier 1 citizen. The prescribed punishment for these violations is immediate termination. Ethan stood slowly, keeping his hands visible and his movements calm. Before you terminate me, may I ask a question? The arbiter's metal face could not show expression, but something in its posture shifted. Unusual, but permitted. Why? Clarify your query. Why is it a crime for me to sit next to another person? Why is it a violation for 2 beings to share a view of a beautiful nebula? Why does the harmonic frequency system exist at all, when there is no scientific evidence that it measures anything real? A murmur ran through the watching crowd, beings of all species leaning in to hear, and Ethan noticed that many of them were holding devices, recording what was happening, spreading it across the station's networks and beyond. Good. The harmonic frequency system is the foundation of galactic civilization, the arbiter recited. It ensures order and stability by placing each species in their appropriate position, based on their evolutionary advancement. But it is not based on evolutionary advancement, Ethan said, keeping his voice loud enough for the recordings to pick up clearly. It is based on politics and power. The Valkyrie were the first species to develop faster-than-light travel, and they used that advantage to establish a hierarchy that put them at the top. The science was invented later to justify a system that already existed. You are spreading dangerous misinformation. I am repeating the findings of Dr. Saylet Vorn, a Valkyrie scientist whose research proved that harmonic frequency measurements are meaningless. Research that was suppressed because it threatened the power of those who benefit from the current system. The arbiter turned its metal head towards Saylet, who had risen to stand beside Ethan, her patterns blazing with colors that seemed to pulse with renewed energy. The outcast speaks to no one, the arbiter said. Her voice carries no. Then hear mine, Ethan replied, reaching into his jacket slowly enough that the guards did not fire, pulling out a small device that he held up for everyone to see. This is a standard human communication unit. It has been broadcasting everything that has happened here to every open channel on Nexus Prime, and from there to relay stations that will carry the signal to every human ship and every human colony, and every species that has ever wondered if the hierarchy they live under is just or arbitrary. The Arbiter went still, its ancient processors calculating the implications. Billions of beings are watching right now, Ethan continued. They are watching a human sit down next to a Velkari woman and have a simple conversation. They are watching me tell the truth about a system built on lies, and they are watching you decide what to do about it. You would martyr yourself for a stranger, the Arbiter asked. She is not a stranger anymore. She is my friend. And where I come from, we do not let our friends stand alone. Salith's hand found his, and her fingers intertwined with his own. Another violation, another rule broken, another moment broadcast to the watching galaxy. I have been silent for 40 years, she said, her voice carrying across the deck with a clarity that surprised everyone, including herself. I have accepted my punishment and endured my isolation because I believed that was the only choice available to me. But this human has shown me that there is always another choice. We can always stand up. We can always speak out. We can always sit down next to someone who is lonely and remind them that they are not alone. The security officers shifted nervously, their weapons still raised, but their eyes darting between the Arbiter and the growing crowd, and the devices that were recording everything. If you kill him, Salith continued, you prove everything he has said. You show the galaxy that the only way to maintain this system is through violence and fear. You turn a simple act of kindness into a revolution. And if we do not kill him, the Arbiter asked, its voice carrying something that might have been uncertainty if machines could feel such things. Then you show that change is possible, that even ancient systems can evolve, that the beings who enforce the rules can choose justice over tradition. The silence that followed stretched across seconds that felt like hours, the fate of one human hanging in the balance while the galaxy watched and waited. Then something unexpected happened. A Velkari man stepped forward from the crowd, his patterns flickering with fear, but his posture determined, and he walked across the deck and stood beside Salith and Ethan. I was her student once, he said quietly. Before she was outcast, she taught me everything I know about real science. I have been ashamed of my silence for 40 years. I will not be silent anymore. Another Velkari joined them, and then another, and then a Drenix pushed through the crowd, and a small furry being whose species Ethan did not recognize, and more beings of all tiers and all kinds, until the observation deck was filled with people standing together, some touching shoulders, some holding hands, all of them breaking rules that had governed their lives since before they were born. It appears, the Arbiter said slowly, that the situation has become complicated. It doesn't have to be complicated, Ethan said. It can be simple. You can let us go. You can report this as an anomaly that requires further study. You can buy time while the galaxy decides what kind of future it wants. And why would I do that? Ethan smiled. Because somewhere deep in your programming, in whatever passes for a soul in a being made of metal and code, you know that what is happening here is right. You know that connections between beings are more important than lines on a chart. You know that kindness should not be a crime. The Arbiter was silent for a long moment. Then it turned to its security officers. Stand down, it said. This matter requires review by higher authorities. No action will be taken until that review is complete. A cheer rose from the crowd, spontaneous and joyful, and Ethan felt Salith squeeze his hand as tears that glowed with bioluminescence ran down her blue cheeks. You did it, she whispered. We did it, he corrected her. All of us, together. And high above them, the nebula continued its ancient dance, indifferent to the small creatures below, who were learning, slowly and painfully and dutifully, that the walls between them were only as real as they allowed them to be. 1 year had passed since a human sat down in a forbidden place and changed everything. Ethan stood at the viewport of his new quarters, a spacious room with a view that stretched across the nebula he had once watched from below. And he still could not quite believe that this was his life now, that the small room with the small window had become a memory of a person he used to be. The Galactic Council had not fallen overnight. Ancient systems never crumbled that quickly, but they had cracked in ways that could not be repaired. And those cracks had spread across 100 worlds, where beings had watched a human break the rules and wondered why they had never done the same. The harmonic frequency system was officially under review, a process that would take decades, but had already begun to reshape the station and the galaxy beyond it. Tier barriers were being questioned and challenged, and in some places simply ignored. Species that had never spoken were having conversations. And everywhere Ethan went, he heard his own words repeated back to him by strangers who had memorized them like prayers. Where I come from, we have a long history of sitting in places we are not supposed to sit. It had become a slogan, a rallying cry, a simple statement of defiance that translated into every language in ways that made leaders nervous and common people smile. Humans had become the most requested species for diplomatic missions, not because they were powerful or advanced, but because they had a reputation now. A reputation for ignoring rules that made no sense and making friends with everyone they met. A reputation for being too stubborn to stay in their assigned place and too kind to leave anyone alone in theirs. Ethan had been appointed as the first human ambassador to the Valkyrie homeworld, a position that would have been unthinkable a year ago, but now seemed almost inevitable. The natural result of a chain of events that had started with a single step up a forbidden staircase. A chime at his door pulled him from his thoughts. "Come in." Salith entered, her patterns glowing with the warm colors that he had learned meant contentment and affection, her 4 hands carrying a tablet filled with the latest reports from her research institute. "The new study is complete," she said, settling into the chair beside him with the easy familiarity of 2 people who had spent a year learning each other's rhythms. "The evidence is undeniable now. The harmonic frequency measurements were deliberately falsified 3,000 years ago to justify a hierarchy that the Valkyrie leadership wanted to maintain. My original research was correct. I never doubted it." "I know," she said, and the smile that crossed her face was something he had once thought impossible, a Valkyrie expression of pure joy that she had relearned in the months since her isolation ended. "Can no longer deny it. They will have to take action now." "What kind of action?" "That is still being debated. Some want to abolish the tiers entirely and start fresh. Others want a gradual transition that will take generations. And some still argue that the system should be maintained with minor modifications. What do you want?" Salith was quiet for a moment, her patterns shifting through shades of blue that Ethan had learned meant deep thought. "I want what I have always wanted," she finally said. "A galaxy where beings are judged by their actions and their character, rather than the species they were born into. A universe where no one sits alone, because their truth was too dangerous for those in power. A future where kindness is celebrated rather than punished." "That sounds like something worth fighting for." "It is," she agreed. "And thanks to you, we finally have a chance to achieve it." Ethan shook his head. "I did not do anything special. I just sat down," Salith said, reaching out to take his hand in one of hers. "And that," she continued, "is why your species is so remarkable. You genuinely believe that what you did was ordinary. You think any human would have done the same." "Most would have. I know. That is what makes it extraordinary. In a galaxy filled with species who have learned to accept their limitations and follow the rules and stay in their assigned places, humans simply refuse. You treat walls as challenges and rules as suggestions and cages as temporary inconveniences, and you do it so naturally that you do not even realize how revolutionary it is. We have our own problems, Ethan said honestly, our own history of walls and cages and people who tried to keep others small. We are not perfect. No one is perfect, but you are persistent. You keep trying, you keep pushing, you keep sitting down in places where you are not welcome, until eventually the welcome changes. Something the galaxy desperately needed to remember. A notification flashed across the viewport, an incoming transmission from Earth, and Ethan smiled when he saw the sender identification. "It is the President," he said. "Probably another request for advice on how to handle the 12 species that have applied for diplomatic relations this month." "Go," Salith said, releasing his hand. "I will be here when you finish. I have 40 years of isolation to make up for, and nowhere I would rather do it than beside you." Ethan paused at the door and looked back at her, this remarkable woman who had stood alone for so long, who had held on to truth when truth cost her everything, who had found hope in the most unlikely of places. "Have I ever thanked you?" he asked. "Thanked me for what?" she replied. "For not having me killed that first day. Most people would have just let the arbiters do their job." Salith laughed, that musical sound that still made his heart feel lighter whenever he heard it. "You sat down next to me and told me I looked like I could use some company. No one had said anything that kind to me in 4 decades. How could I possibly have let them hurt you after that? So kindness saved my life." "Kindness started a revolution," Salith corrected him, her patterns glowing bright gold. "Yours and mine, meeting in a moment that neither of us planned but both of us needed. The galaxy is changing because 2 lonely people found each other and refused to look away." Ethan nodded and turned to take the transmission, but before he left, he said one more thing, words that had been building in his chest for months. "I love you, you know." Salith's patterns exploded into colors that his translator had no words for, cascading lights that seemed to fill the entire room with warmth. "I know," she said softly, "and I love you, human. I love your stubborn heart, and your impossible optimism, and your complete inability to stay where you are told. I love that you saw someone sitting alone and decided that was unacceptable. I love that you climbed stairs that should have killed you, just to offer a stranger some company. It seemed like the right thing to do. It was the right thing to do, and now the whole galaxy knows it." Ethan smiled and went to take his call, leaving Salith in the room with the beautiful view. And as he walked through corridors that had once been forbidden to him, he passed beings of every species who nodded and smiled, and sometimes stopped to shake his hand, or pat his shoulder, or simply say thank you. The station hummed around him, the same station that had tried to put him in his place a year ago. And now it was slowly becoming something new, something better, a place where the tears were fading, and the barriers were falling, and beings were learning to see each other as equals rather than categories. It was not perfect, and it was not complete, and it would take generations to fully realize the promise of that day on the observation deck. But it had started. The change had begun, and it had begun with the simplest of acts. A human had broken a rule and sat down beside someone who was lonely, and nothing in the galaxy would ever be the same. In the archives of Nexus Prime, the incident was recorded under its official designation, the Cole Violation. But across the galaxy, in stations and ships, and worlds where beings gathered to share stories of hope and defiance, they called it something else. They called it the day someone finally sat down. And they taught their children that sometimes the bravest thing a person could do was not to fight, or to conquer, or to win. Sometimes the bravest thing was simply to sit beside someone and say, "You looked like you could use some company."